The sky was perpetually grey in the Yorkshire suburbs, where Windermere Manor stood silently amidst a sea of thick mist. Ancient elm trees stretched out like gnarled hands, casting shadows over the once vibrant garden. Lady Eleanor sat in the drawing room, her gaze quietly following the faint rays of light that filtered through the tall windows. Her jet-black hair was neatly tied in a bun, exuding an air of elegance and authority. Beside her, a mahogany jewelry box lay slightly ajar, revealing gemstones that sparkled like imprisoned stars. But among them was a conspicuous gap, a space where Lady Eleanor knew a necklace had once rested. Her lips pressed tightly together. She couldn't recall lending it to anyone, nor could she imagine misplacing it. "Perhaps it's just my memory failing me," she murmured, though an unsettling feeling lingered, as if the house itself whispered reminders. Lord William entered, his usual air of confidence intact. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, and the polished leather of his shoes clicked sharply against the wooden floor. His piercing blue eyes swept across the room but lingered on his wife only briefly, as though her presence had become so familiar it blended seamlessly into the space, like the fireplace or the ancestral portraits on the walls. "You seem pensive, Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth as silk yet tinged with a certain detachment. "Is something troubling you?" Lady Eleanor turned to him, a faint smile gracing her lips but never reaching her eyes. "It's just, I can't seem to recall where I left my ruby necklace. The one I cherish so much. You remember it, don't you?" Lord William raised an eyebrow but regained his composure in an instant. "Perhaps you placed it somewhere and forgot. You have so many treasures. It's hard even for you to keep track." "Perhaps," she replied softly, her eyes fixed on his face, searching for something beneath his composed exterior. But she found nothing. Lord William gave her a courteous bow before leaving the room, a strange coldness lingering in the air behind him. That evening, in a small cottage not far from Windermere, Miss Annabel stood before a mirror, her fingers gently caressing the ruby necklace glowing brilliantly under the light of an oil lamp. Her pale skin contrasted with the deep crimson of the gemstone, creating an image of mesmerizing beauty. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes alight with joy. Lord William had gifted it to her during a secret rendezvous, a promise that their relationship would be more than fleeting. But as Annabel leaned in for a closer look, a sudden chill swept over her, sending shivers down her spine. She glanced up at the mirror, her bright eyes still sparkling. But something had shifted. For a fleeting moment, her reflection appeared distorted, her beautiful face marred by strange bruises. Annabel staggered back, gasping for breath. Yet when she looked again, it was just her face, as ordinary and lovely as before. "I must be imagining things," she reassured herself. But the unease remained, smoldering beneath the surface like an unseen fire. Back at Windermere, Lady Eleanor remained seated in the drawing room. She looked up at the ancestral portrait hanging on the wall, a woman with sharp eyes and a ruby necklace eerily similar to the missing one. Beneath the painting, faint golden letters read, "Margaret Ashwood, 1783. A cold draft swept through the room, causing the candles to flicker precariously, as if about to be extinguished. Lady Eleanor sighed softly, yet deep down, she felt a change stirring. She had no way of knowing that the ruby necklace, with its tragic history, was opening the door to something far beyond her imagination. The following morning, pale sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of Windermere Manor, but it failed to dispel the chill that crept through every corner of the house. Lady Eleanor descended the staircase, her posture as poised as ever, though a quiet unease weighed heavily on her heart. An intangible intuition whispered that something within the house was changing, as if an invisible door had just been opened. Breakfast passed in silence, broken only by the faint clink of spoons against porcelain plates. Lord William, as usual, was absorbed in his morning paper, his eyes skimming the headlines with detached interest. Yet Lady Eleanor noticed a subtle restlessness about him, He occasionally glanced at his silver pocket watch. "William," she spoke, her voice calm but tinged with scrutiny. "Last night, I had a strange dream." "Oh? A dream?" Lord William replied without looking up. "Yes, a woman with a disfigured face. She stood in our bedroom, whispering things I couldn't quite understand. But the strange part is—" Lady Eleanor paused, her sharp gaze fixed on her husband. "She was wearing a ruby necklace, exactly like the one that's missing." Lord William set the newspaper down, his expression briefly betraying a flicker of tension before his composure returned. "It was just a dream, Eleanor. You've likely been thinking too much about the necklace." Lady Eleanor said nothing, offering only a faint smile. But inside, she was certain that something lay beyond the realm of imagination. Not far away, Miss Annabel was having a less pleasant morning. The ruby necklace, still snug around her neck, now felt suffocating, as though it were binding her. She had tried to remove it, but for some reason, the clasp seemed stuck fast, refusing to budge. "How can this be?" Annabel murmured, her trembling hands tugging at the chain again. But the necklace remained immovable, as if it had become a part of her. She rose and approached the large mirror in the corner of her room. As she looked into the glass, her reflection began to blur, as though a dark mist was rising to obscure it. Then, from the shadows, a face emerged, the face of a woman with eyes blazing with hatred. Her distorted visage was marred with bruises stretching from her forehead to her chin. Annabel screamed, stumbling backward, but when she looked again, the mirror reflected only her and the empty room. Her breathing came in sharp gasps as her hands clutched her throat. "This can't be. It's just my imagination," she whispered, but deep down, she knew something was watching her. At Windermere, Lady Eleanor had begun to investigate the origins of the necklace. She sifted through old books in the library and finally discovered a yellowed page hidden within a leather-bound journal. It told the story of Margaret Ashwood, the woman who once owned the necklace. Margaret had been accused of infidelity in the late 18th century and was executed by her own husband in a fit of rage. The ruby necklace, her wedding gift, was said to have absorbed all her pain and hatred in her final moments. Rumor had it that whoever wore the necklace would fall victim to its curse, and the traitor would be punished. Lady Eleanor set the journal down, her heart pounding. "Margaret Ashwood," she murmured, the name echoing in her mind like a warning. She stood and looked at the portrait on the wall. The eyes of the woman in the painting seemed to stare directly at her, as though trying to convey something. A cold breeze swept through the room, making the curtains sway gently. That evening, when Lord William returned, he found Lady Eleanor standing in the drawing room, a glass of wine in her hand. The candlelight cast dancing shadows across her face, giving her the appearance of a cold, sculpted statue. "Eleanor, are you all right?" he asked, feeling uneasy under the sharpness of her gaze. "Perfectly fine, William," she replied, her voice sweet yet laden with undertones. "I've just uncovered an intriguing story about our family's history. Would you like to hear it?" Lord William shivered slightly, unable to predict what awaited him next. Night fell upon Windermere Manor, enveloping everything in a thick, impenetrable mist, like a curtain concealing dark secrets. Lady Eleanor sat alone in the drawing room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting sharp contrasts of light and shadow across her face. In her hands was an old journal, its yellowed pages carrying the faint musty scent of time. "Margaret Ashwood," she repeated the name once more, as if trying to grasp the deeper meaning it carried. Curses, hatred, and death all seemed to surround the ruby necklace, dragging the spirits of the past into the present. Suddenly, a soft knock echoed from the door. It was not the knock of a person, but a strange, rhythmic, and chilling sound. Lady Eleanor turned her head, her gaze falling upon the large mirror opposite the fireplace. In the mirror, she saw her reflection, but it wasn't just her. Another face, distorted and hazy, peered behind her, its eyes burning with fury. Lady Eleanor flinched slightly but quickly regained her composure. "Margaret," she whispered, not knowing why the name had slipped from her lips. The figure vanished, leaving only her own calm reflection staring back. But the air in the room grew heavier, as though the house itself had come alive, breathing dark and malevolent breaths. Meanwhile, Lord William sat in his private study, a glass of whiskey in hand. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts were restless. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Annabel's face. Not the beautiful visage that had once enchanted him, but one now twisted with bruises and lifeless eyes. A soft sound at the window startled him. A dry branch scraped against the glass, producing a chilling noise like fingernails clawing at wood. He set down his glass and rose, stepping toward the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains. He saw nothing but darkness outside. Suddenly, an icy chill ran down his spine. In the large mirror near his desk, he glimpsed a figure standing behind him. It wasn't Eleanor. It was another woman, her black hair disheveled and her bloodied face horribly disfigured. She stood silently, her eyes fixed on him. "No, this can't be real," Lord William shouted, spinning around. But behind him was only an empty room. The mirror now reflected a solitary man. But his heart pounded as if he had narrowly escaped a nightmare. At the same time, Annabel lay on her bed, her wide eyes staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of an oil lamp in the corner. The ruby necklace around her neck now felt heavier than ever, like an invisible chain tightening its grip. Each attempt to remove it left her skin burning as if scorched. Sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, whispers echoed in her ears, muffled voices, in a deep, feminine tone, accusing and cursing her. "The traitor will pay." Annabel bolted upright, gasping for breath. But as she looked into the small mirror on her dressing table, she realized she was no longer alone. A cold hand rested on her shoulder, and when she turned, that distorted face was right before her. At Windermere, Lady Eleanor stood before Margaret Ashwood's portrait. Her eyes met the gaze of the woman in the painting, as though the two were communicating across an invisible boundary. Lady Eleanor whispered, her voice so faint it seemed only she and Margaret could hear it. "I am not the traitor, Margaret, but I know who is." The candle beside her flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to thicken. Lady Eleanor turned away, her eyes sharper than ever. She knew the secrets of Windermere could no longer remain buried, and that retribution was drawing near. A thick fog coiled around Windermere Manor like a shroud of death. Tonight, the house carried an unprecedented air of gloom. Every hidden corner, every dark hallway seemed to exhale the chilling breath of restless souls. Lady Eleanor stood on the second-floor balcony, her pensive gaze fixed on the garden below. The once vibrant rose bushes were now withered, their thorny branches clawing outward like desperate, skeletal hands. A strange sensation crept over her, a blend of fear and a peculiar calm, as though she had grown accustomed to this haunting presence over time. Downstairs in the drawing room, Lord William confined himself with a bottle of whiskey. He slumped in an armchair, his vacant stare locked on the flames in the fireplace. Ever since the strange visions had begun to haunt him, his mind had found no peace. He had tried to convince himself that it was all mere imagination, a fleeting nightmare. But the truth, no matter how much he denied it, stalked him relentlessly. A soft knock broke the silence. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, yet it tore through the stillness of the room like a blade. Lord William started, turning sharply. The drawing-room door was slightly ajar, but beyond it lay only darkness. "Who's there?" he called, his voice more unsteady than he intended. No answer came. Only the wind howled through the cracks in the doors. As if mocking him, he stepped toward the door, his trembling hand pushing it open. The hallway beyond, once lit by candles, was now engulfed in darkness. But at the far end, The faint light flickered. A figure stood there, a slender silhouette of a woman in a long dress, her hair cascading down to obscure her face. "Annabel?" Lord William called, his voice barely audible. The woman did not reply. Instead, she stepped back, as if beckoning him to follow. Lord William's feet, as though guided by an unseen force, began to move toward the figure. Elsewhere, Annabel sat curled up on her bed, her wide eyes fixed on the small mirror across the room. The reflection staring back at her was no longer her own. The face bore her features but was distorted with pain and hatred. The eyes that stared back were not hers. They belonged to someone else. Return it to me?" A whispered voice emanated from the mirror, like wind slipping through cracks in a door. Annabel began to sob, her hands clutching the ruby necklace that burned against her skin. She had tried to remove it countless times, but each attempt brought searing pain, as if the necklace had become a part of her, a chain binding her to a dark fate. "Please, let me go," she pleaded, but her cries dissolved into the empty air, unanswered. Suddenly, the mirror cracked, a hoarse laugh echoed from within, and Annabel saw the figure of the woman in the mirror rush toward her. At Windermere, Lady Eleanor descended the stairs and entered the drawing room where Lord William was supposed to be. But the room was empty. Only the dying embers in the fireplace remained, and the large mirror on the wall reflected her figure. But she was not alone. In the mirror, Margaret Ashwood stood, her dark eyes boring into Eleanor. The ruby necklace gleamed on Margaret's neck, its light reflecting like congealed blood. "Margaret," Lady Eleanor said, her voice unervingly steady. "I know you are here." Margaret said nothing, but her eyes, filled with bitter hatred, seemed to pierce Eleanor's very soul. A cold wind swept through the room, and the sound of footsteps echoed somewhere in the house. Lady Eleanor turned to see Lord William enter, his face pale and stricken with fear. "Eleanor," he stammered, "it's following me." Margaret, she did not respond, only stood silently, watching her husband. In her eyes, something unnameable glimmered, not fear, but judgment. "I did not awaken this curse, William," she said, her voice low and cold as steel. "You did, with your betrayal." Lord William froze, as though every denial he had clung to now returned to tighten its grip around him. The room fell silent, save for the wailing wind outside the windows and the burning gaze of Margaret Ashwood in the mirror. The wind howled outside Windermere Manor, as if nature itself was unleashing its fury. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Lady Eleanor stood tall, her hand lightly resting on the arm of a chair, her eyes never leaving Lord William. Before her, he knelt on the floor, his face pale, his wide eyes filled with terror. "Eleanor, please, you must believe me," he pleaded, his voice choking in his throat. "Believe you?" Lady Eleanor let out a thin smile, devoid of warmth, laced with bitterness. "I did believe you, William, and you repaid that trust by betraying not only me but the very soul of this family." Lord William tried to rise, but it was as if an invisible force pinned him down. From within the large mirror on the wall, Margaret Ashwood's figure appeared, more vivid than ever. The ruby necklace gleamed on her neck, blazing like a fire consuming the last remnants of hope. "Margaret, no, please, spare me," Lord William screamed, but Margaret stood silently, her eyes blazing with hatred. In a small cottage nearby, Annabel writhed on the floor, the ruby necklace around her neck now tightened as if it meant to strangle her final breath. She screamed, but her cries echoed only into the empty space. Margaret's image appeared in the mirror before her, a contemptuous smile etched on her distorted face. "You chose this necklace. You chose the path of betrayal," Margaret whispered, her voice sharp as a blade cutting through Annabel's mind. A piercing scream tore through the room, then abruptly stopped. As the oil lamp extinguished, the room fell silent, and the ruby necklace slipped from Annabel's neck onto the floor, cold and lifeless. At Windermere, Margaret stepped closer to Lord William. Her figure was both beautiful and terrifying, the embodiment of all the pain she had endured. With each step she took, the room seemed to grow darker. "He does not deserve to live," Margaret said, her voice echoing through the room like a death knell. Lady Eleanor did not respond. Her gaze remained eerily calm, but inside, her heart was heavy as stone. She did not forgive Lord William, but neither did she wish to witness his end directly. Margaret reached out, and Lord William screamed as his body was dragged toward the mirror. In his final moments, his figure dissolved into the glass, leaving the room empty and silent as if nothing had happened. Lady Eleanor stood still, her eyes falling on the ruby necklace lying motionless on the table. Once a dazzling ornament, it now resembled a frozen mass of blood. She picked it up, feeling the chilling cold seep through her fingers. "Margaret," she spoke, her voice soft yet resolute. "You have had your revenge. Now, rest in peace." Margaret's reflection in the mirror gave a slight nod. Though her eyes held no forgiveness, she vanished, leaving the mirror to reflect only Eleanor's face. But in her eyes, something had shifted. Lady Eleanor walked to the fireplace and threw the ruby necklace into the flames. The fire roared violently, like an enraged beast, but within moments, the necklace melted away into ashes. Even as the fire subsided, the house remained colder than ever. Lady Eleanor understood that the curse had not truly disappeared. It merely lay dormant, waiting for another moment to awaken. Years later, Windermere became an abandoned house, left to decay. Stories of the curse, of Margaret Ashwood's ghost, and whispers in the mirrors were passed down through generations. It is said that on moonless nights, if you stand outside the manor and look through its windows, you might see a woman with cold eyes staring out from the darkness. And if you dare to look closer, you may glimpse the ruby necklace, still intact, shimmering like congealed blood. The curse of Windermere never ended. It merely waits, like the darkness within the human heart,